Hello and welcome to Bloomberg Quint. The 15th Finance Commission had a particularly tough task on hand this time, with the pandemic impacting the government finances across the globe. The Finance Commission, which lays down the principle of tax distribution between the center and the states, submitted an exhaustive report which is running into more than 1,400 pages, which was tabled in Parliament in the budget session. Joining us today is the architect and the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission, N.K. Singh. Sir, thank you for taking out time to join us.
Welcome.
I would like to ask you this question about how, between the previous Finance Commission and the present one under you, there have been significant fundamental change in terms of the center to state fiscal relations. When I say that, it's the immediate thought that comes to my mind is the dismantling of the Planning Commission, introduction of GST, and above all, we had a global pandemic as well. So, can you throw some light on the Finance Commission's approach this time?
Well, the approach is in two parts. First, given the uncertainties and given the volatilities in terms of behavior, we did try to calibrate these uncertainties to try and see to what extent we can give predictability and stability. Now, the first example of this predictability and stability is that the 14th Finance Commission had made a very sharp upward in terms of the total divisible pool to the states from 32%, which existed in the 13th Finance Commission, to a very sharp increase of 42%. In the past, Finance Commissions have always made incremental changes. It used to be 29, then 31, and 32.5. 32 went to 42. The one issue was whether this would be shaved down, retained, or in the somewhat difficult thing, looking at the stress of the states moved up, which is what the states wanted. On this score, we opted for stability and predictability, but notwithstanding the other issues on arising out of some of the factors which you have mentioned, we have retained the devolution of the states at 42 notionally, actually 41, because 1% went away for the two new created union territories of J&K and Ladakh. So predictability and certainty, this was one aspect. The second very critical challenge was the terms of reference themselves, because after 40 years, we were asked to this time use the census data of 2011. So since the 6th Finance Commission, which was did the thing from 1974 to 79, all finance commissions were using only the census data of 1971. And that census data, which data we use, then influences that historically population has always been given a weighted in the devolution formula. And what population base you use has therefore a very direct relationship with how much resources is devolved to the states. Now, that was used to be always on the data of 1971. So when this was changed after 40 years to the data of 2011, which is what the president asked us to do, there were serious apprehensions in the minds of many states, particularly the southern states, that they had done a much better job in demographic management, in investment in education, in health, in girl-child education, and so on. And that would there much more significant improvement or qualitatively significant improvement of demographic management, instead of being rewarded would be penalized. So that was the apprehension. That was a very big challenge. How we addressed it is because we introduced the horizontal criteria. We divided into 3 parts. Needs were represented by population using the 2011 census data, by geographical area, and by forest cover. On forest cover, it was 7.5. Forest cover was introduced for the first time as a criteria in the 14th. They had assigned a weightage of 7.5. We increased it to 10%. So this was needs. Then the second important ingredient always is equity. Namely, are you giving adequate resources to those parts of the country and those states which are poor? And what about the poorer states? How do they take care? So for that, of course, we continued with the well-recognized measure of equity by giving it on the basis of per capita income. The distance of the state's per capita income, with the highest, technically it is Goa, but it's a small, very small state. So we chose really the distance from the next one, which is Haryana, and have given a weightage of 45% to the equity weightage. The third is recognizing efficiency and rewarding performance. We introduced 2 criteria. We introduced what we called demographic management, which we introduced for the first time, and we gave it a weightage of 12.5%. This, to some extent, overcomes that limitation of using the population census data of 1971. Finally, we are given a small percentage of 2.5% to fiscal efforts and improved tax realization to improve resource base. So that's how the composite was made up in terms of that as a second important challenge. The third important challenge which we faced on the issue of what to do with the pandemic, which you have rightly pointed out. Actually, the title of this Finance Commission's report is somewhat unusual. It says Finance Commission in Pandemic Times, or in COVID times, rather, what we have used. So we did that in 2 ways. We did that first and foremost in terms of assigning a separate chapter on health and improving health infrastructure. Now, that is going to be subsumed by the finance minister's statement in a broader approach of restructuring the central and do that. But we did something more. For the first time, we assigned 70,000 crore for our award period to the third tier, namely urban local bodies and panchayats, in improving the health infrastructure, primary health centers, district hospitals, need for infectious diseases, testing laboratories. So we addressed this issue of the pandemic by addressing it exactly where it is, on what could be done to redress this neglect of the health and health infrastructure, particularly at the cutting edge, namely at the level of panchayats and urban bodies. Then, of course, there are 1 or 2 other unique features, which I will just mention in a minute, which is the fact that this time we were asked in a very unusual terms of reference to consider the issue of a non-lapsable fund for defense expenditure. And if we did come to the conclusion, what kind of a financing mechanism would be appropriate for meeting the needs of a non-lapsable defense fund to meet the capital expenditure of both defense and of internal security. And one last word, it was also an unusual commission because the president gave us terms of reference which covered a whole lot of issues on monitorable performance criteria and to consider those. And of course, the one classic one, which is a permanent one, is to consider the fiscal consolidation roadmap for the general government. Now, considering The fiscal consolidation roadmap of the general government in a pandemic time like this is a heroic act. Uncertainties are huge. And for general government, I'm using because the map in relation to debt and the consolidation roadmap in relation to not only the behavioral pattern of the debt, but enabling assignments of fiscal deficit numbers means both for the states and for the center. We responded to this particular challenge in three ways. First, by giving a range, then a fixed point. We realized that given the uncertainties, we have given both for the states and for the central government a range, a fiscal range, then a point. And we have hoped that at the end of our award period, the debt numbers for the general government will begin to move in a somewhat southward direction than the continuing march in the northward direction. We have also responded to this fiscal issue by suggesting that given all these uncertainties, it may be better for a new approach or for a new intergovernmental committee to go into this. Intergovernmental because it must involve the states and the center, and looking at all these uncertainties, to look at the issue of fiscal deficit as maybe cyclically adjusted, if that is possible, and to work out also what would be appropriate debt numbers. Part of the reason why the debt numbers this time look rather swollen is not only on account of the increased pressure, but also because of much greater transparency, which the finance minister has brought about in terms of the borrowings by parastatals, contingent liabilities, guarantees, and so on. And therefore, the numbers are more credible and transparent. And of course, there is an expectation that this example of the central government will be followed by the states when they also give a more accurate picture in terms of state or parastatals. And so I'll stop here.
Okay. I would thank you. That was really insightful. And what I would like to touch upon, one of the aspects that you also mentioned in your different approach is the sector-specific grants. I mean, the previous Finance Commission had moved away with the practice of giving out a sector-specific recommendation for grants. So what was the motivation behind giving out a recommendation for sector-specific grants? If you can please tell us about that.
The motivation was twofold. First and foremost, it was a response to specific in the terms of reference. So unlike other finance commissions, we were given pointed suggestions to think on sector-specific grants. So that's my first. We didn't do it suo moto, but we responded on to some ingredients of the terms of reference. Second, if you look at the sector-specific, the three important areas where the bulk of the recommendations are. One, big recommendation is in the health sector, which I have mentioned. That in addition to the 72,000 crore, which has been accepted and will be done by the third tier, we had also given a recommendation of 32,000 crore to be given to states to meet certain critical health sector gaps. And the pandemic had a direct impact on our thinking in relation to the health sector. The second big area in which we gave was agriculture. We realized that notwithstanding the current controversy on the three laws, and these were recommended by successive governments for a long period of time, and would only enlarge the choice patterns without taking away any rights. Agricultural reforms need deeper action to move to cropping patterns which are more water efficient, less excessive use of fertilizers and pesticides, less of a charge on the declining groundwater aquifers crop diversification to move to the changing food habits and needs of an average Indian, into higher protein content, animal protein, vegetable protein, dal, pulses. Then what to do to promote the exports of agricultural products. We have a huge agro-export potential in this country. And therefore, how to improve the productivity of the agriculture sector as a whole to double farm income in a foreseeable future. So the bulk of the expenditure is on these two. There's a third component, the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, which is for the maintenance of rural roads. That normally, when these roads were built, the contractors sign a 5-year maintenance contract. But when that comes to an end, then of course you need to keep these repaired. And looking at the stressed finance of the states, earlier the proportion for the maintenance borne by the central government used to be much more. We reduced that, but we did suggest some allocation for the maintenance of the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. So these were the broad contours. Now, state-specific in addition to the sector-specific, these are small sums. They were not given by the 14th because in the 14th, don't forget that they raised it from 32 to 42.
Yes.
13th gave, 12th gave. We followed the same tradition of what has happened. We kept the devolution. We haven't raised it from 41. If we had raised it to 43, let us say, the issue would have been different. Keeping that, and also don't forget one particular fact, that between the 14th and the 15th, on account of the rising incidence of cess and surcharge, the size of the divisible pool had come down in absolute terms, not in percentage terms, because 41% is off from the divisible pool, but the divisible pool, if it shrinks. So let me, for your own comfort, Somesh, tell you 3 words which you must know. One is GRR, gross revenue receipts, which includes everything, right? The gross revenue receipts for the full 5-year period, we estimated, be 153.4 lakh crores. Out of this, take out all dividend payment from the Reserve Bank, take out user charges, you take out dividends from the PSUs, you take out, say, spectrum charges, and so on. You get to what is known as the GTR, that is gross tax revenue, comes to 135.4 lakh crores for the 5-year period, right? Now, out of this, the divisible pool is a subset. So just as the GTR is a subset of the GRR, the divisible pool is a subset of the GTR. So from 135.4 lakh crores, the divisible pool is about 103 lakh crores, right? Out of this 103 lakh crores, so the divisible pool, as you can see, has been abridged. From 135, it has come to 103 lakh crores. Out of this 103 lakh, the 41% devolution to the states gives them about 42 lakh crores, right? But because the divisible pool has shrunk, we have added to it the grants component. The grants component, namely 2.94 lakh crores by way of what is known as revenue deficit grants. Particularly, it has gone to those states where, in spite of the 12.5% to demographic management, their resources position remained rather strained. So 2.94 lakh crores have gone by way of revenue grants, are close to 3 lakh crores. Over 4 lakh crores has gone to the third tier, the urban local bodies, the municipalities. At this time, we have covered all the 3 layers in the urban local body, unlike the previous finance commission, which covered only at the village panchayat, but the district and the intermediate was left out. We have covered that. We have covered the Schedule 6 area in the northeast, those like Bodoland, tribal societies, where they may not have elections in the normal way, but for all effective purposes, they are really elected entities. We have included this. We have included the cantonment. So we have given over 4 lakh crores, 4.26 lakh crores to the third tier. Then we have given 1.22 lakh crores to the disaster, to the State Disaster Management Fund and to the National Disaster Management Fund, both taken together. So our award for over 10 lakh crores on grants is over and above what goes to them from the 41%. This is in a sense a compensating mechanism for the somewhat reduced size of the divisible pool. Whether it has been adequately and completely addressed or not, we have tried to do whatever under the limited constraints, under the constraints we had of the resource limitations, particularly during the pandemic and other uncertainties. That's the best that we could do to balance the interests of the states with that of the union, which we hope we have been able to do equitably, with propriety, with a sense of judgment, with a sense of fair play, which hopefully will continue the legacy of trust which the Finance Commission has enjoyed from its very inception.
So, as you have rightly pointed out, the size of the divisible pool having been compressed because of the cesses and surcharges, and also the fact that you had considered giving out a state-specific grant as well, instead of tinkering with the devolution part, so to say. So, did you for once consider increasing the devolution from 41% to 43% instead of taking all these measures? Or did you completely think of a different approach from the day one?
No. I think it's a very fair question. It was in the end, it was in a sense an appropriate balance, because as far as 41% or 42% is concerned, the states would have been happier if this had been raised up. There was no state to visit out of the 28 states. They wanted it calibrated enough. The central government said that, after all, please do not forget the history. They had been calibrated very sharply from 32 to 42%, and that the finances of the central government are exceedingly stretched out. And being one of the recipients of our award, they would have been happier if this had been moderated for understandable reasons in a somewhat downward direction. So we had to do a balancing act, and what we have sought to do is therefore the balancing of not bringing 41% down to impart stability and continuity. Let me add that domain experts, in fact, someone for whom I have considerable, not only a very good friendship, but I respect his views, is Rangarajan, the former governor of the Reserve Bank and a chairman of the earlier Finance Commission and the chairman of the 12th Finance Commission, Chakravarti Ramir. He said that 42% is about the limit that can be given, provided the debt and surcharge limit of how much it can circumscribe the divisible pool is also determined by a particular legal provision in such manner. Because the issue of cess and surcharge is not in the hands of the Finance Commission, which you know.
Yes.
This is an issue where in the Constitutional Amendment Bill of 2000, the 80th Constitutional Amendment Bill introduced 2 new provisions in the Constitution, which specifically kept the cess and surcharge outside the divisible pool. So unless the constitution is changed, no finance commission can choose to include that. So it may require a more holistic review of this 80th Amendment done in 2000, which, by the way, was also a bargain, because till 2000, I want to remind you that before that, when the Finance Commission began, only income tax was being shared. A little later, excise came to be shared. Then higher proportion of income tax and higher proportion of excise came to be shared. Then in 2000, with the 80th Amendment, the entire resources were to be shared, namely corporate taxes, customs, excise in full. Now the GST is to be shared. And as part of that, they kept cess and surcharge out. But I'm not clear whether in the debate at that time on this constitutional amendment, there was any debate relating to prescribing a statutory limit on the extent to which debt and surcharge can foreclose increasing proportions of the invisible pool.
So, as a part of the balancing act, as you said, do you think going forward we need a cap on the amount of surcharges that are to be collected, or the cesses that are to be collected by the center? Do we need to impose some limit, or is there any other way to?
I think that we need to debate this, because it's not something that the Finance Commission can do suo moto. We did what we could, namely that instead of writing poetry on this, of wanting to put a limit and so on and so forth, we actually calibrated. So as of now, debt and surcharge as a percentage of the gross tax revenue crept up from 10.4% in 2010-11 to 19.9% in the BE of 2021. So over a period of 10 years or so, as you can see, virtually there's a doubling of that. So what we have done is that in our own projections, we have capped this at 18.4. Now, this doubling is also partly optical, because this includes the compensation cess on account of the GST. So that compensation cess entirely goes to the states. So if you take that out, which is about 3% or so, this 19.9 minus that would be in the region of around 16%, which of course is also substantially higher from 10.4 to 16%. But we need to keep certainly this element in mind. But I will answer that by saying we certainly need much wider consultations among all stakeholders on the future. I have written for long that we have too many cesses. They were all imposed at a particular point in time. There has been some rationalization, but still the number of cesses and the extent to which these cesses have gone in for uses which were designed by the legislations concerned, all that needs a more fundamental review. And the issue of debt and surcharge requires stakeholder consultations of arriving at some kind of a framework which imposes a statutory limit. Because it cannot be the intention of any government. Certainly it was not the intention of the constitutional experts. Certainly it was not the intention in the constitutional amendment that whatever is given by way of Finance Commission's awards are neutralized by a simultaneous rise in the incidence of debt and surcharge.
So you said that they were rightly pointed out that there are too many cesses around, and one of the cess that was introduced, in fact, after the Finance Commission report was given to the government, was this new agricultural cess we saw in the budget. But the way it was introduced is also something which some experts say is worrisome, because it was introduced by cutting down on the basic rates, and a hike in the surcharge was there in the form of agricultural cess. So what do you think of this development which just come after the Finance Commission report?
I don't want to go into that, because that is a subject, as I told you, not in the domain of the Finance Commission. But the more generic comment remains that we need to have wider stakeholder consultations and a consensus on the nature, number, and the modalities for debt and surcharge as we go forward.
In a lot of interviews that I've been reading, sir, what I have also noticed is that you have stressed upon the need to revisit the seventh schedule of the Constitution. And when I mean, on this, can you share some perspective as to why it's required right now more than ever, and what kind of approach should we have to kind of deal with this?
So I think that the approach has to be a holistic approach. At the particular time when the Constitution was framed, the nature of the Indian economy and the nature of the Indian polity was vastly different than it is now. And therefore, there was, as you know, three: list 1, list 2, and the concurrent list. Subjects which were designed for the states. Those of the union were also very categorically written. And then, of course, there was a concurrent list. Now, over a long period of time, the entry in the concurrent list has somewhat increased. Namely, education was brought in, environment, forest was brought in, family planning has been brought in. This was through the enlarging the number of items in the concurrent list themselves. More importantly, what you need to focus is that you look at all the centrally sponsored schemes. Quite a few of them are in areas which represent the entry in the state list. Let me give you an example. Manrega was not enacted by this government, but Manrega was enacted by the UPA government much earlier. Employment is whose responsibility? Who is responsible? Who should be responsible for employment? It would be normally an entry in the state list. Let me give you another example. If the states claim autonomy, and rightly so, whose responsibility should it be to provide education to the people of the state? The state. And yet, Parliament, in its wisdom, enacted a stand-alone legislation, the Right to Education Act. So you have cluttered it already by independent parliamentary stand-alone legislations on subjects which are really crisscrossing between the center and the states. And the cluttering up of far too many centrally sponsored schemes, and the finance minister recognized this. She mentioned in her budget speech that based on the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission, a deep restructuring of centrally sponsored schemes is underway and will be implemented. Hopefully, the plethora of centrally sponsored schemes would be deeply rationalized. You have centrally sponsored schemes with very small outlays, and the cost really of running them, or they may have outlived their utility and so on. So apart from broadbanding and genuinely focus on national priorities. But when you do that, all that, you may still require a more fundamental visit to the 7th schedule itself of the Constitution. Namely, in today's time, is that 7th schedule as relevant as it was at the time when the Constitutional was being crafted by our constitutional forefathers? That is why I have said that instead of cluttering up, and this diversity didn't begin now. The concept of the centrally sponsored scheme, if you recall, this 7th schedule must be read in conjunction with Article 282 of the Constitution. All centrally sponsored schemes done by the Planning Commission earlier was really by the use of Article 282, which permits central government and the state government to make any grant of financial resources available for any scheme or project for public purpose, right? So this, in a sense, this article was the fundamental basis for all these centrally sponsored schemes, whose huge plethora and number, which you can see only growing. Therefore, I think one must take the bull by the horn. One must really say that the seventh schedule requires a more intensive fundamental debate. Let me give you another example. Law and order is a principal entry in the state list. And yet, when we talked, the Commission talked to the Ministry of Home Affairs, a lot of the deployment of paramilitary forces for maintenance of law and order and other responsibilities are with the states. They are being used increasingly by the states. So here is a subject which was domain of the states, but by practice, this has got changed. So should it not be a good time for this issue to be holistically revisited, recognize that the contemporary challenges of an India which does not see these classifications, and in fact, one of the things which does not respect either the territory or this classification is a march of technology. Look at 4G, 5G, Internet of Things, machine learning, artificial intelligence. Its application across sectors of economic activity really fundamentally changes the manner in which you want to have such fixed entries. And I think that to some extent, I'm glad that this will hopefully come in public domain for more and more domain experts to comment and engage in discussions which will lead to some constructive outcomes.
So do you still suggest we should continue with the formula of having three lists like union, center, union, state, and the concurrent list, or should there be a very different approach towards this?
I don't know. That's what I raised the issue, that even if we have, and we should, because how else are the states' functions to be defined? How else are the union functions to be defined? What kind of a malleability and what kind of a flexibility do you need to introduce, looking at contemporary changes, with increasing interdependence of India, with increasing globalization of India, our global interdependence, with the march of technology, with the expectations from elected governments changing in a fundamental way. After all laws are designed in the end to serve the broadest interest of the people of India. And I think all elections are run on the basis of commitments and promises made by the leadership to meet the aspirations of the people who are the electorate. So in this spirit, I do believe that we certainly need more thinking, a more considered, in my view, widest possible consultations as we go forward, because India's economy is bound to realize its potential, and India is going to change fundamentally by what the whole host of other measures have taken place, particularly the march of technology, connectivity, the far-reaching economic reforms which are underway. The patterns of migrations will undergo a change. Agriculture is bound to undergo more fundamental changes when you begin to apply the use of technology to improve agricultural productivity and outcome. And in multiple ways, the learning outcomes, I think, will also undergo a big change by the onslaught of technology. I think all this affords, this is the opportune time to consider fundamental changes of this kind.
Some analysts, when you talk about the Finance Commission report, some analysts have termed the entry-level conditions and the performance-linked grants for local bodies imposed by the Commission as excessive. So what was the philosophy behind such a move, and what do you have to say to such critics?
Well, I have two comments to make. First, critics or supporters must recognize that under the Constitution, the Finance Commission is not obliged to assign any resources to the third tier. All that the Constitution says is that to suggest Finance Commission will suggest appropriate measures to augment the consolidated fund of the state for enabling them to perform the devolution of adequate finances to the third tier. So nowhere the Constitution places an obligation that the Finance Commission should really and must assign the resources for the third tier. Unfortunately, this provision has not been observed. State finance commissions have not been uniformly constituted. If they have been constituted, their reports have not been placed in the legislature. If they have been placed, follow-up action has been tardy and hesitant. And therefore, the resources of the state are not adequate enough based on all this to be able to discharge what the Constitution expected the functions. So that's point number one. Point number two, therefore, this was not by way of a right, but by way of what we felt was a practical step forward. So what have we done? On the one hand, we have very substantially increased our devolution to the third tier, even though we were not obliged. In doing so, what we have done are two important steps as entry conditions. Who would want to deny that, after all, these are public funds? The proper auditing and accounting of the expenditure of these public money must be done in accordance with the norms which are established. So that is one entry condition. The second important entry condition in respect of urban local bodies is the fact that after the GST, the urban local bodies had come to helplessly depend only on the state government or with Finance Commission. We have said that one important area where they can substantially increase their resources and become self-sufficient financially is property tax. The property tax laws in most states remain opaque, they're outmoded, they have no relationship or benchmark. So that's the second kind of a condition. This is in their own interest to try and achieve long-term financial sufficiency and to move them away from a helpless dependence on either the state government or the central government or the successive awards of Finance Commission. Then, after these entry-level conditions, we have assigned, for instance, I told you, 70,000 crore to the health sector. Anyway, they need it because the rudimentary health infrastructure needed it. And then resources have been earmarked for urban local bodies for pollution in Metro 1 cities, which has a population of 1 million and plus. We all know what air pollution is doing to life quality. Using the resources to bring about better environmental management and improving the ease of breathing, as people say, was something which was there. Then resources have been earmarked for national priorities like sanitation, drainage, piped water, recycling of urban waste, and so on. So, and then there is a very substantial part of the resources which are still left untied to meet the needs which they are considering appropriate. So in a sense, therefore, we feel that we are strengthened by our recommendations, the working and the finances of the third tier as they go forward, and have done so by assigning significantly higher resources than they had received from the 14th Finance Commission.
But when we talk about the past, sir, what happened was during the 13th Finance Commission's award, there were, I think, 9 conditions that were imposed for the urban local body grant. But the money was retained by the center because the states couldn't implement those. So what do you think? I mean, can the similar situation happen even here, or how do you see we can approach this?
We hope not, because we believe that the level of consciousness has been significantly enhanced by the third tier, and there will be enough pressures which will be generated through the political apparatus and how critical elections of the third tier are in the State Assembly. So I think that the generation of these kind of popular sentiments would certainly put pressure on the state government to follow the entry conditions and to implement the overall framework which would enable them to receive the award which has been given by the Finance Commission.
The centre's revenue deficit is effectively used for funding the centrally sponsored scheme. And do you think some of the states be allowed to run revenue deficits and be given greater freedom to decide where to spend?
So let me put it this way. The issue of the rationalization of the centrally sponsored schemes based on our recommendations is well underway. And so that's the first response to you. The second response is that as far as this Finance Commission is concerned, we have used very stringent norms to cap the revenue expenditure of the states and to assign buoyancy numbers and revenue, which are challenging. And only that which cannot be done anymore, either by way of better expenditure management and outlays and revenue buoyancy, we have sought to address through recourse to the revenue deficit grants. We recognized that these revenue deficit grants are debited to the central government's finances, and therefore we wanted to be mindful of the stressed fiscal situation of the central government. And that is why we have adopted an approach which we believe
Last question to wrap up the interview, sir. You have also touched upon the, as you rightly mentioned at the start of the interview, the debt trajectory that we'll see. And you envisaged that we'll go on a southern slope towards the end of the award of the Finance Commission. So, and since you're a part of the FRBM review committee as well, do you think we should abandon debt as the anchor for the FRBM for this period? What do you think? What kind of a revamp do we require in terms of FRBM targets?
Not at all. Not at all. In fact, the FRBM committee, which I had the privilege to chair, the last FRBM committee, the fundamental change of that committee to the earlier version of 2003 was that we decided to adopt debt as the principal macroeconomic anchor, and fiscal deficit targets are enabling operational obligations to meet that debt trajectory, right? So this is, I think that as far as investors are concerned, domestic or foreign, or domain experts or rating agencies, they looked at the debt behavior as the principal macroeconomic anchor in looking at the country's overall economic policy. So the retention of debt is central to any kind of macroeconomic policy as an important anchor. Fiscal deficits are targets for enabling the direction of the debt direction of the debt in a manner which would be consistent with the overall framework and policy. So in the FRBM committee, I had indicated 60% by 23-24 or 24-25 as the overall general debt of the general government and a fiscal trajectory for achieving this. Now, since then, there have been, as I told you, a lot of fundamental changes. I have also come around to the view that looking at the situation, maybe a range is better than a fixed point. Also, I have come that in volume 4 of my report, my report is in 4 volumes. Volume 4 of my report, we have given a disaggregated, unique debt path for each state, depending on the economic analysis of that state's finances. So I think looking at all this, the sort of restructuring which is needed is to recognize all these uncertainties and to recalibrate both the debt numbers and the enabling fiscal deficit numbers, and also address this challenge of whether fiscal deficit numbers should be fixed point, should be a range, should they be cyclically adjusted? Because cyclical adjustment is easier said than done, because what part of the cycle you are in and what methodology you want to use it remains a bit problematic. But nonetheless, the need to introduce flexibility is something which will need to be factored in by that. And the need to make states the active partner. The central government changed the FRBM Act, original FRBM Act, in the 2018 Finance Bill. Most state governments have not. What kind of an inducement, an incentive should be given for enabling them to align their FRBM Act with the Central Act? We have in this time given the states some flexibility, 4% instead of 3%. We have also given them flexibility of a 0.5% extra borrowing based on deep reforms of the power distribution companies, which we feel is central to the management of state finances. But we believe that in any coherent picture, both on debt and fiscal deficit, must have states as an active partner for it to truly become a consolidated fiscal roadmap and debt roadmap of the general government, meaning the center and the states.
Great. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us and for the insightful chat and